Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Skowron. I'm a senior analyst here with KERAMIDA. I reside in California. We have a small team out there, and I sit within our greenhouse gas calculations team, life cycle assessments, decarbonization strategies and plannings is my wheelhouse. So I'll be talking today about how to assess your supply chain's greenhouse gas emissions. So thinking if your company creates and sells a product or a service, all the emissions from raw material extraction, production, distribution, transportation, use phase, end of life. That's the whole supply chain at your company, and specifically we'll be focusing on the procurement side, so the upstream steps of your product and service. So the agenda, I'll go over the Scope 3 categories a little bit in depth, so thinking the framework of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard. If you all have heard of that before, that's the gold standard right now for greenhouse gas accounting in the corporate world. I'll go over some approaches to data gathering that our clients have used and that we consider best practice to date, the different data types that you should be requesting and gathering and that you can use to actually calculate greenhouse gas emissions from. And then I will go over 2 brief case studies that we have worked with in the last year. So what are Scope 3 emissions? I'm sure a handful of you have seen these graphics before. This is from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So there's 15 categories of Scope 3, the indirect value chain of a corporation that the protocol breaks out different various activities into. So there's the Scope 1 and 2 that we've already talked about today. That's from your company's owned or controlled sources within your operations. So if you own or lease a fleet or buildings or manufacturing sites. And then the Scope 3 upstream activities are really all of the activities that your company is spending money on. So your suppliers, there's a few categories in here that aren't directly related to a product or service, such as like employee commuting and business travel. But the remainder of the categories, really, if you think about emissions at a product level, they pretty much follow the life cycle of a product pretty nicely. So with the upstream activities, thinking about the purchased goods and services that you have to purchase and procure from all of your suppliers that go into the product, if there's any capital good investments in that reporting year, the upstream transportation, third-party logistics providers that you may have to outsource with. All of those emissions are categorized under upstream activities. So we'll be focusing on how to calculate emissions from those types of activities. And one thing I wanted to call out is, and that's been touched upon a lot today, is how a company decides what to disclose on, what of these activities are relevant for your company to disclose on. And right now within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol framework, it's really left up to the company to decide which is relevant for them to report on. What they want to decide are material in terms of their suppliers and categories that are relevant, as long as they provide justification as to what they're excluding or what they deem not relevant to their operations or value chain. And here's just another statistic about the magnitude of supply chain and Scope 3 emissions compared to a company's Scope 1 and 2 owned or controlled emissions. I think Nikki had put out like an 80% number today, and this number come the 26 times that of a company's Scope 1 and 2 emissions. This is coming from the CDP's report that they released this summer, specifically talking about those upstream categories. So thinking the category 1, category 2 through 8. So this stat is excluding the downstream use phase, end of life. So typically, when approaching a Scope 3 assessment, we, with our clients, will start with a spend-based approach, and we'll see where their procurement records, where their spend data is lying, and we'll tend to focus our assessment overall first there to see where their hotspots are going to be. But let me go into some of the approaches that companies can take to gather some of their data for calculating this type of assessment. So first, an approach is to request your information directly from your suppliers. So we've been talking all day about supplier engagement. So some examples again of the data exchange that can occur is through supplier pilot programs. You can set up the pilot with your critical top suppliers to gather data from them, creating survey or data requests. And this type of approach requires very heavy communication, education, in order for it to be effective and successful. Another approach is to gather data from your internal company records. So as I mentioned just a second ago, starting with spend data approach. So that is really gathering your procurement records from your procurement team on total spend by category, by vendor, to assess your company's activities and where you're spending money on. And another approach is to gather data directly from publicly available sources. So as we all know, companies are publicly reporting their emissions totals, whether that's through sustainability reports on their website or the CDP reporting platform. So those types of sources are also an option to assess and gather data from. So some types of data: what are we actually requesting from suppliers or internally within our company, and what can we use to actually create a metric tons of CO2 equivalent number from. From requesting data from suppliers, looking at some metrics such as gathering their total production for, let's say, a material that you are sourcing from that specific supplier, and requesting them to provide a percentage of the total product that they sold directly to your company. And you can come up with an allocation method from their metric tons total from that material. So engagement there with getting data from suppliers. And then some secondary data options is gathering data from internally within the company. So again, with your procurement team, you're going to need to gather that spend report. The best way to do this is trying to get as granular as possible, if available. So spend amount by material, spend amount by product, spend amount by procurement category. These are all options that we can work with to do a spend-based calculation. One methodology, and this is shown on the following slides, but what to do with the spend data is you're going to use an emission factor that has an emissions intensity based on dollar spend amount. And that emissions intensity factor represents a cradle to gate activities of that specific material. So for example, if you purchased steel, you need to use the steel emission factor based on dollar spend. That emission factor theoretically would represent all the way back from inception, so the cradle raw materials, all the way up to production. Here, so just very high-level summary of types of calculation methods, the general approach. You would take your activity data, so with the primary data, that would be in the form of for the example on this slide is your suppliers' data from their publicly available CDP report. So you're able to take your suppliers, Scope 1 and 2, and any of their relevant Scope 3 categories that may be material that they have publicly reported, and you can multiply that by the percentage of the supplier's revenue to the company by the total supplier production. That's an allocation method to come up with a total metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So that's one example of an approach that you could use with publicly available data from your suppliers. And then using data that you have gathered internally, your spend data. So an exercise that clients will have to go through when they're using spend data is to map all of their procurement categories or materials by a North American Industry Classification System code, the NAICS code, because the EPA, the data set that we use is developed by the EPA, and they create emissions intensity factors by the NAICS code. So the process is to map your spend data categories to these codes, which have an associated emission factor, and then adjust by inflation, since this data set is based on spend data from a specific reporting period. So it might not always align with the data that you are calculating for that reporting period. And I just wanted to highlight an example of a company. If you, let's say, so the scenario is you have procured services from a trucking company. They are your supplier to move all of your goods that you're gathering from your suppliers to your warehouse, to your manufacturing site, and maybe they're doing the external transportation and distribution after your manufacturing site as well. So you need to calculate emissions from the total spend that you spent with this trucking company for the reporting period 2023. You want to make sure, so if you look in the second column, there's various NICE codes that one could apply to this trucking vendor, but they have vastly different emission factor values, ranging from 1.115 to 0.303. And multiplying that factor by millions and millions of dollars will lead to vastly different emissions totals. So the point here is you want to make sure that you go through the process of applying the correct emission factors to your activity data, in this case spend, otherwise, and involving, in this case it would be your procurement team, to make sure that those assignments of those emission factors make the most logical sense with the data that you have available to your team in that reporting period. If you overlook certain assignments or aren't quite sure of the emission factors that you're applying to your data and what they're actually representing, the totals can be widely different, and we don't want to base our decarbonization plans and capital and operating investments in future years off of data that was incorrectly calculated in the base year. So some pitfalls we recommend to avoid are applying the incorrect emission factors, and in this case, it would be the NICE codes to your materials, and then using the most recent version of the emission factor data set is often a step that we find in a lot of our verification auditing projects actually. Very old emission factor data sets are being used to calculate a 2023 reporting period worths of data. And as the grid decarbonizes year over year, we want to make sure we're using the most up-to-date emission factors that represent renewables in the grid or alternative fuels that companies are using. We don't want to use 10 plus years old worth of emission factor data sets. So just wanted to call those two pitfalls out. The first case study I wanted to highlight was when we were working with a global manufacturer, suppliers in all regions across the world, hundreds of suppliers, and so they wanted to launch a pilot program with their suppliers to take the first stab at calculating their Scope 3 emissions, but also trying to go the next step beyond spend and seeing what data they would be able to collect directly from their suppliers in that year to set them up to set decarbonization targets and goals from this data. So the results of this whole exercise and process, they took 3 different approaches to assess their entire Scope 3 procurement-related upstream emissions, and internally wanted to compare what the results would come out to be. So the first approach was the results that the suppliers had provided back from the pilot program, and this data exchange came through a pilot scorecard data collection spreadsheet where the suppliers provided the data directly through that scorecard spreadsheet and submitted it back to the company. Then the second was spend-based, so what we just reviewed in the last few slides, going through the process of mapping the NICE codes and by procurement category, by material type. And then the third assessment to compare against was using the CDP data that the supplier had reported publicly in that previous reporting period. So as you can see, there's high variance in the numbers from each of the results, and the point here is that high level of communication is required if you're doing a pilot program to make sure your suppliers understand where, as Vicki mentioned, like where to put the data in the spreadsheet. It sounds trivial, but some organizations still will send you links instead of sending you the actual data. So making your request is uniform with little opportunity for wiggle room for the supplier to interpret it in a different way is super important. And then working closely with your internal teams on making sure your assignments are correct, that the person who's gathering data from CDP public reports really understands what data they're supposed to be pulling from that report to make sure that you can compare things more apples to apples instead of taking numbers at whole that you might not necessarily understand where they came from and how they derived those numbers. And then the second example I wanted to highlight was the work that we did with a global gift card retailer. So they're in charge of manufacturing they outsource their manufacturing to their tier 1, tier 2, and plus suppliers, and then they are in charge of the retail and distribution of the gift cards in all the stores and online that you all are familiar with. So they wanted to conduct a greenhouse gas life cycle assessment of their product. They had been working closely with a few of their North American suppliers on improving their sustainability initiatives within at their paper mills and some other initiatives. And so they really wanted to move away from spend-based calculations to calculating the actual footprint of their products so that they could reflect all of the great work and investments that they have been working on over the last year. So with this approach, the data exchange, the data requests that went out were to their Tier 1 and a few of their Tier 2 suppliers actually in North America. That was the boundary that the study decided to focus on, to gather the supplier's energy data, the bill of materials, so all of the extra materials that those Tier 1 suppliers had to outsource, the quantity of the materials that they brought into their sites, and then the output of the product once it was completed. And so our team was able to take all of the primary data from the suppliers and come up with a whole life cycle assessment from cradle to grave was the scope that we decided to do. And we did it was a comparative assessment, so comparing their plastic products to their paper products. And the result of this was not only were they able to highlight the initiatives that they've been taking within their company over the last year, but they're able to create a model for all the rest of their products outside of North America, and so we created a model where they could plug and play different regions that they're sourcing the suppliers in different regions, and they're able to update their Scope 3 inventory with their product lifecycle assessment factors rather than the spend-based method. So this is an example of progression, next step after you've done your initial screening assessment with spend data, kind of a next step once you have your goals set, decarb plan in place and rolling, how are we actually going to reflect that in our inventory? Just wanted to share that one example of next steps after going through all these efforts. So that's the last example that I wanted to share today. Yeah, so the theory is a company's Scope 1 and 2 emissions might be your Scope 3 emissions. And so there will never be double counting in that way, and a company should never add their Scope 3 emissions totals together, if that makes sense. And I also think we looked at this question a little bit earlier. That came in a little bit earlier. The example was around if you use FedEx, UPS, and Amazon, and you want to get data from them on the transportation distribution that you've sourced from them. Those types of suppliers actually have great systems set in place, and they'll generate emissions reports and activity data reports specific to your company. So they track at their customer level all of the shipments that they do in that reporting period. So they'll give you specific reports to your engagements with them. I don't think we've ever recommended taking a percentage off. I would say don't take the commitment that your supplier has announced publicly, like face value. I would definitely ask follow-up questions, see if they've gotten the target validated, if they've gone through an organization such as SBTI or a separate third-party assurance on the target, and if they have a reduction plan in progress or already set in place. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say adjusting their target value makes makes the most sense at this stage where most suppliers are in. Yeah, inflation factors vary by country, and so you'll want to look at the data set that you're using and make sure you know what unit of measurement it's in, what currency it's in, and there's publicly available inflation factors by commodity type. You can get down to that level. There's also inflation factors as an economy whole that you're able to use. So different options there. And happy to connect offline if you want specific links and stuff that we use.
Let's give it up for our supply chain here.